Well, my clock says it's straight up 12 noon. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Fourth State Dairy Nutrition and Management Conference webinar series. We continue today featuring Katelyn Goldsmith, who will discuss the growing understanding of factors that influence colostrum yield and offer strategies to support colostrum production and manage through periods of low colostrum yields. The Fourth State Dairy Nutrition and Management Conference presents the latest research on nutrition and management of dairy cattle and has expanded the conference impact on the industry with this webinar series. The conference and webinars are a collaborative effort of Iowa State University Extension, University of Illinois Extension, University of Minnesota Extension, and University of Wisconsin Extension. Will have an evaluation in the chat box before leaving the program today. I'd appreciate if you would go ahead and click on that. It's short and your input helps us to improve future programs. Katelyn Goldsmith serves Wisconsin's dairy producers as a statewide dairy outreach specialist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Extension. In this role, she bridges the gap between research and practical on-farm management by developing resources and programs tailored to the needs of dairy farmers. Raised on a family's dairy farm in Iowa, Katelyn went on to receive her bachelor's from Iowa State University and a master's focused on dairy cattle nutrition from Michigan State University. After working as a dairy cattle nutritionist, she joined UW-Madison Extension, where she enjoys helping farms find functional, research-backed solutions to everyday challenges. As I always say, Katelyn, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you for that introduction. I'm glad to be here today presenting. This topic, I think, is a really front of mind topic for people around this time of year. During the fall and winter, we seem to get a lot of questions about low colostrum yields. And so that kind of sparked some of the articles that I've written about it and then this presentation. So to kind of frame what this discussion is going to be today, there's four main parts that we're going to talk about. We're going to start with what is the problem that we're experiencing? Why do we care about the problem? Why are we even here today, sitting here listening to me talk? And then we're going to go into what factors do we know play into lower colostrum yields or just colostrum yields in general. And there's a lot of factors out there. The approach I'm going to take today is we're going to do kind of a bite-sized approach to it. We're going to go into the different factors, but not too heavy in depth. Then we're going to talk about practices that you can do on farm or you can suggest to farmers to help encourage colostrum yields. And then lastly, if you're dealing with those low colostrum yields and you're wondering, how do I feed my calves? How do I manage through this situation? That's going to be the last section we'll talk about, how to manage through those low colostrum yields. So to start with, what is the problem? I don't think we're surprised by the name of this title that the problem is related to low colostrum yields. Some farms report periods of low colostrum yields, and it's particularly common during the fall and winter, but it can happen any time of the year. I get calls from farmers in the summer that are dealing with this. It can be any time of the year. Why do we care? Well, to begin with, I think it's pretty well understood in the dairy industry that providing that early, adequate volume, high quality colostrum, it's really critical for calf health and survival, especially those early days in life. And so when we don't have that colostrum on hand, when we're struggling with low colostrum yields, it gets really difficult to provide that colostrum to that newborn calf. And then it also makes it really difficult to maintain a solid colostrum bank. If we're constantly pulling out colostrum from our bank to feed our calves, we're not putting more back in to rebuild it. And at some point in time, our bank's going to hit zero, and we're going to have to figure out what to do there. Another consideration, colostrum replacers are great. They're really good for when you're in a pinch, but when you need to use them consistently because you just don't have the colostrum yields, those costs can add up pretty quickly. And then lastly, it kind of summarizes all of those things. It's just staying frustrating when you cannot get that colostrum to feed that calf, when you have to use that colostrum replacer, when you just don't have the colostrum there and you have cows that are making milk. What the heck's going on? It's frustrating. So that leads us to the question, what causes low colostrum yields? What's going on here? And there's a growing amount of literature out there, and especially in the last probably 5 years, we've seen more literature being written. And that's kind of what I'm going to discuss today is almost like a literature review with you guys. And when I looked through the research that's out there, I pulled out some of those big things that seem to either consistently come up in the research, things that we have some pretty solid backing that, yeah, that has something to do with colostrum yield. And then there's a couple of things I pulled out and I put on this list that maybe don't have that super solid backing yet in research, but there is some promise and probably some more information that'll come down in the line in the future. If you're like me, you look at this list and you go, oh, wow, that's kind of overwhelming. That's a lot of things to keep track of or try to wrap my brain around. So how we're going to work through this presentation today is we're going to break it up into how my brain kind of breaks it up into 5 main categories. We have the environment, nutrition, calf factors, cow factors, and then some management things. So to begin with, we're going to look at the environment. And when I talk about environment right now, we're really going to focus on photoperiod and temperature and humidity. If you're unfamiliar with those terms, photoperiod is just the daily length of daylight exposure that you have. So in the summer, when the days are longer, you have more daylight, longer photoperiod. Temperature humidity index, I think a lot of people are pretty familiar with that term, right? We use it a lot when we talk about heat stress. It's that measure where we combine air temperature and humidity, or how I always compare it to people that are unfamiliar. It's like the feel like temperature when you talk, or when the weatherman talks and he says, well, it's 80 degrees out, but it feels like it's 95 degrees out because it's so humid. That's what temperature humidity index is. So to understand what that looks like, kind of in the context of a year, I've mapped it out for Madison, which is where I'm based. And what I have on here is across the year, the red line is that average daily temperature, and the yellow is the average hours of daylight. Not surprising, when we get into the summer, it gets warmer, we have longer days. When we get into the fall and winter, shorter days. You're probably noticing it right now when it's like 5 o'clock and it's dark out, and it gets colder. So that's what photoperiod and THI looks like over the seasons. Now, people have, for a while, noticed, well, hey, my lowest colostrum yields tend to always fall during the fall and winter. And my highest colostrum yields tend to always fall in early summer. And this kind of pattern started appearing to people. And this thought came up of, okay, is this what appears to be a seasonal trend? Is it related to photoperiod and temperature humidity index? And what we have, there's a couple studies out there in terms of research have found there is a correlation there. There is a statistical correlation. So this study out of Texas, it was with a big Jersey herd, tracked throughout an entire year, colostrum yield, and then a bunch of other factors. But I really like this table when we talk about the photoperiod and THI conversation. On this graph, we have that calving week along the bottom. That's week of the year. And if you're like me and you think in months better, I added that January and July mark in here. But it's really easy to see in this graph that relationship, where as colostrum, that solid line goes down, we also see that the dashed line, photoperiod, and the dotted line, THI, is also following a very similar trend. And in this study, they did find that there was a statistical relationship there. There was some sort of correlation occurring. So when it comes to photoperiod and THI, colostrum yield does have a seasonal trend. Research has found that there's a seasonal trend. People just in general talking farmers, there's a seasonal trend there. but why? Um, Potentially due to photoperiod and THI, what we've discussed. But kind of that caveat there is we don't know if that is correlation or causation at this point. We don't know, is it just because of some other things that are related to season that THI and photoperiod kind of hop along, and that's also why it's related? We're not sure. And then when it comes to photoperiod THI, is one or the other really driving it, or is it a combination of the two? It's also unclear. And that kind of comes down to the fact that it's really hard to parse those two apart, right? When we looked at that graph, THI and photoperiod are pretty similar, like they follow a very similar trend. So it's really hard to pull those apart and determine which one is the main factor without doing some really good controlled studies. And those just really haven't happened yet. There's two that I can find that really played around with photoperiod primarily. And based off those two, THI might be more of an important driver than photoperiod, but we need a little bit more research out there to really nail down on that. And then a question that popped up into my mind when I really started looking into this, and I think I hear a couple other farmers ask it too, is well, if colostrum yields tend to be higher when photoperiod is longer during those summer months, should I be doing long day lighting for my dry cows? It's a great question, right? It follows what we know, but right now, don't recommend it. There is one study where they did play around with short day lighting and long day lighting in dry cows, and they didn't find that long day lighting improved colostrum yield. And then we have a decent amount of literature out there that has found short day lighting improves production during lactation. So I'm not sure if the risk is worth the reward there of doing long day in hopes of colostrum, but maybe not getting that production in lactation or just sticking with that short day and trying to keep that production up during lactation. So when it comes to photoperiod and THI, this is the big takeaway I give people. Don't be surprised. Don't be surprised that you see a seasonal difference in colostrum. Why exactly? Photoperiod THI, maybe, but the seasonal trend is there. But the big but here is seasonality only explains a portion of colostrum yield differences. It is not the sole make or break thing that is going to cause the differences in yields. And this was really well demonstrated in a study out of New York, out of Cornell. Trent Westhoff did this study. They looked at 18 herds across the state of New York. And in theory, all in the same state, experiencing similar photoperiods, similar THI, right? Similar experiences there. And they found across those herds, you see that seasonal difference, it is there. But you also see across these herds large differences in yields when you compare them to each other. So in theory, they're all experiencing that same seasonality change. What is that other, those other factors that are playing that are making the differences that happen, which is what this list is here to kind of dive into. So the next one, the next big category here is nutrition. I pulled out three kind of key nutrients we seem to talk about a lot when it comes to pre-fresh diets. And when I talk about nutrition, it's going to be focused on pre-fresh diets, particularly close-up pre-fresh diets. So we have carbohydrates, fat, and protein. And carbs and fat sometimes get combined in this conversation because we just talk about upping energy, but I divided them out for this presentation. So to start with carbohydrates, one of the main things we can do is we can up starch, right? In hopes that maybe that we get some more colostrum yield. A couple different studies have played around with starch values and really upping it a lot has not significantly improved colostrum yield. I threw 20% on here because that kind of seemed to be around where a lot of these studies were comparing above and below. It's definitely not a hard cutoff. But when we increased it, didn't really see significantly improved colostrum yield. There's one or two that sees numerical increases. but nothing really that says this is it. That study out of New York, they kind of divided out their the animals in the herds into different starch levels when they were comparing this. And they looked at low, high, and moderate. And that moderate for them was 18.5 to 22.5. And they saw that was where they saw the greatest colostrum yield, the best correlation. And so a moderate is probably going to be adequate enough. The other thing to keep in mind is high starch diets can cause a decrease in immunoglobulin concentrations. Might be related to the fact that you could see a little bit more yield, but then the IgG doesn't follow along, so you actually lower your concentration. Could be something with the actual IgG mechanism. Not entirely sure there, but with a high starch diet, maybe you see some higher yields, but you're gonna potentially lower quality. So going higher than the 20% probably isn't gonna get you the benefits that you want. When we talk about fat, there just isn't really a lot of research out there, honestly, about feeding fat in that late dry period, and then also looking at colostrum responses. The sparse literature we have out there says probably isn't going to get you more colostrum. I think we probably need to look a little bit more into that. Something that you risk here with supplementing fat in that late dry period, and you also risk it if you really up that starch, is if those animals don't need that energy, you could start getting some pretty tubby late dry cows. And that's typically not very great for transition. Protein seems to be the nutrient I've been hearing a lot more chitter chatter about lately when it comes to dry cows and formulating those diets. There's been a decent amount of research looking into it. I will say on this slide, I'm talking specifically about metabolizable protein, not crude protein. And what those research studies have tend to kind of fall into is that increasing your metabolizable protein levels beyond like a 6.5% to an 8.5% doesn't seem to really affect colostrum yields, especially in those older animals, so with lactation plus. That 6.5 to 8.5 based kind of on typical dry matter intake. So that's going to be about like a 800 to 1100 grams of metabolizable protein. Now, I separated out older cows from younger animals. That's because younger animals, those ones going into either their first lactation or maybe their second lactation, they may benefit from having those metabolizable proteins closer to that higher end of that 8.5% or potentially higher. And the reason that I pulled them out is one, there is a study where they looked at feeding metabolizable protein and they found a tendency that when we fed more MP to those animals entering second lactation, a tendency for greater colostrum yield. Now, it's a tendency. It was one study. We kind of need some more experience, some more research there to really solidly stand and say this is what level we should be at. But there is promise there. And there's also a good meta-analysis that saw that, you know what, we probably would benefit from feeding those younger animals a little bit higher, potentially closer to maybe like the 1100 grams of MP, specifically when we think about those animals entering their first lactation. So with these three key nutrients, kind of the big talking points to have with them, moderate starch levels are probably going to get you where they need to be. Going high, it's not going to guarantee you more colostrum. You might see some lower quality. And if we really boost it up, we risk fat cows, and we also risk getting into what I call the risky rumen territory, which is where things maybe aren't jiving as well in the rumen, and we want to avoid that during transition period. More fat doesn't seem to really get you more colostrum. And then when it comes to that protein in older cows, you can probably stick to the metabolizable protein recommendations that are out there, those NASEM recommendations. They're probably going to get you where you need to be. Younger cows, they may benefit from having a little bit more metabolizable protein, or at least being on that higher end compared to where we can maybe go a little bit lower in those older animals. I threw the NASEM close-up diet requirements on a slide. Not everybody has those in front of them all the time. And really, main thing I wanted to point out here is that a lot of those recommendations we just talked about fall pretty close to what NASEM says you should aim for. The big one there being that metabolizable protein could probably be a little bit higher for those older animals. So nutrition is not just those three nutrients. There's some other things related to nutrition that I'm going to point out. So I'm going to start with milk fever prevention strategies. Negative DCAD, zeolite A. In general, research really hasn't seen if you feed them, you're going to have a negative effect on colostrum. Same thing, doesn't really show that you'll have a positive effect on colostrum, but they're probably not hurting you. I do put in general here because there is a couple studies that have said that going really strong with your negative DCAD diets, it may decrease colostrum yield. And where those diets kind of saw that difference was less than -8 or less than -7 milliequivalent per 100 grams. It is a big may. Those are two studies out of a decent amount of studies out there. A lot of those studies didn't see an effect. These two studies did. So it could be something that's playing into effect and maybe something that needs to be investigated, but something to keep in mind. When it comes to vitamins, there's been an okay amount of vitamin research out there. There's tends not to be a lot of new vitamin research being done, but there's been some recent ones looking at vitamin D, specifically different sources of vitamin D, and have seen some promise when it comes to colostrum yields. Everybody's going to have to forgive me for my pronunciation. I really try to say cholecalciferol correct, but I may struggle. But when we talk about vitamin D, the two sources that have really piqued interest is cholecalciferol, which is kind of that traditional source. We've used it a lot in diet formulation. And then calcidiol, which has been a little bit more of a talked about source. And there's some potential there. This study by Poindexter that I have on the slide, they did two different dosages of each calcidiol and cholecalciferol. And they saw that calcidiol supplementing it, there was a tendency for increased colostrum yield. Now, that is a tendency, right? We love to see a statistical difference, especially if you're a numbers person. I think there's some potential there, and I would love to see some more research kind of come down the line and really nail that this is something that we can use. But I do think it's an interesting area and something that might be beneficial to explore. And then when it comes to additives, there's a lot of additives out there. If I talked about every additive, it would be a whole webinar series. So what I tell people when it comes to colostrum production and additives that claim to improve colostrum production, just always ask for the proof. You want really good controlled research. That's going to be the gold standard. So things like coming out of university settings, or independent research farms. Make sure that you have that good gold standard before you give them your money. We're going to talk about calf factors now. This is going to be more of a brief conversation just because these are things that are more difficult to kind of change feasibly and also meet your management needs. So the first thing, calf sex. Males and twins. I know twins are not technically a sex, but they kind of get lumped into this category. Males and twins are associated with more colostrum yield when we compare to single females. So that's about 4 to 8 pounds more for males, or about 2 to 3 pounds more for twins. Also, calf size. Larger calves are correlated with greater colostrum yield. And I love this graph from Connolly where they took these calves and they broke them into different groups, different size groups, and looked at the colostrum weights from their dams. And this is in kilograms. If you do not think in kilograms, quick tip, take it times 2. It'll get you pretty close to what the pounds are. Technically, it's 2.2, but take it times 2, it'll get you pretty close. So what she saw, or what they saw there, was when we got above kind of that 80 pounds is where we saw more of a break and there was more statistical difference compared to these younger ones. But you can see that as animals get larger, their dams seem to produce more colostrum. Why? That underlying biology, I have not seen any research yet specifically to cows, but it could be some hormonal stuff going on there. Um, Unsure. And then the last one on this slide, stillbirths. Stillbirths are associated with less colostrum. And so these are things that, like I said, kind of difficult to really tweak in terms of just trying to get more colostrum. I don't think I would recommend changing your breeding plan for all bulls so that way you can get more colostrum. But it is helpful to keep in mind if you know you have a rash of bulls that are about to be born, you might have some extra colostrum on your hand. Make sure that you're getting that stored. Or if you know that you're going to have a rash of females born during the middle of December, maybe as we get up to that December, we need to make sure that we're getting things stored so we're ready for that. Diving into cow factors, there's quite a few here that we can talk about. The first one I want to talk about is probably the one we have the best evidence for when it comes to influencing colostrum yield. Dry period length is important. Shorter dry periods, and when I say shorter, I mean 0 to 30, 0 to 40 days. Those dry periods result in lower colostrum production compared to longer dry periods. Again, this Westhoff study where they divided it up into those animals that had a shorter, less than 47 day, longer, greater than 67, and then that in between, there was statistical difference. And as we get further out, we see more colostrum produced. Now, we don't want cows that are having 90-day dry periods solely so we can get more colostrum, right? It doesn't make sense in terms of management on the farm. But what this does tell us and what it guides us to think is at least make sure that we're aiming for what I call kind of that traditional dry period length, that 40 to 60 days. That's going to get us more colostrum than if we're really pushing our animals on a short day dry period. We want to make sure that we get that kind of locked in. Mastitis is one of these slides I threw in here where we do not have a ton of research in this area, but I still want to mention it because one, no matter what we're talking about, whether it's colostrum or not, managing mastitis is important, right? I think we all understand that managing that mastitis is really going to help the animal in terms of just general performance, general success, especially transitioning into milking. There's limited research in this area, really only like 2 studies I could find that looks at mastitis or even somatic cell count and colostrum production. And one of those studies didn't really see anything, but then the other found that persistently infected quarters, so quarters that had that infection at the end of the dry period, did produce less colostrum than those uninfected quarters. It's about 1/10 of a gallon. For some people, they may go, well, gee, 1/10 of a gallon isn't much. But if you're already struggling with colostrum yield, beggars can't be choosers. Make sure that you're really managing that mastitis because at the end of the day, I would take that 1/10 of a gallon and store it if I can, than having nothing. So we don't have a ton of really solid research when it comes to mastitis, but I do think it's something that we need to at least focus on. We're going to kind of do a quick run through of a couple other ones that are interesting to know, but maybe aren't top of the mind items. Genetics, can you breed for more colostrum? The answer is probably yeah. There's been some loci that have been associated with colostrum yield that have been identified. It appears that it could be a low to moderate heritable trait. But right now, is it really feasible to do it? Not really. None of our breeding factors that we have, we don't have anything that we can really breed for colostrum yield, especially on the sire side. If you are aware of cows on your own farm that are producing a lot of colostrum, potentially you could try to continue to breed that line for a lot of colostrum, but we just don't really have the good structure there to make that a breedable trait right now. And also still need to understand, okay, just like with any trait, if we breed for this trait, are we going to affect some other trait? Don't know yet. Parity, I don't think it's overly surprising probably for anybody listening in that younger animals, those first lactation animals, are going to produce less colostrum than those older cows, especially those second, third lactation animals. So don't be surprised when they come in and they don't make as much colostrum. Keep that in mind if you know you have a rash of heifers coming in, that this might be something you need to remember. Previous production, I put in here because there has been a decent amount of studies that have looked at some form of milk yield indicators, whether that's previous 305-day milk yield, whether that's current milk yield, a lot of different numbers that people have looked at, kind of tried to see if there's something going on there. Has a mixed relationship with colostrum yield. It seems to be that there's either no relationship or a positive relationship. It's good because we know there's no negative relationship, right? High milk yield probably doesn't equate to low colostrum yield, but it might not have a relationship at all. It's really a mixed bag. And I think the question that comes up with that is there all of these other things out there that play into milk yield that probably also plays into colostrum yield, and that's why we don't see that relationship, or sometimes we do, don't entirely know. And then metabolism. So metabolism seems to be more of a recent topic when it comes to colostrum yield. There's actually a study in Journal of Dairy Science, I think posted like 5 days ago, that kind of started to look into this. There's been a couple other studies that I've seen there might be some relationship, and this is with things like milk fever or subclinical milk fever, NEFAs in blood, BHB. There's not a lot that we know, but we have an idea. Something might be happening there. What really needs to get kind of parsed out is it truly, this having low NEFAs? There's a lot of things that play into that, right? A lot of management factors that play into milk fever. So is it all of those things that might be playing into it that might also be playing into colostrum yields? How is that relationship? What does that web look like? There's a lot of things to keep in mind. So it's an emerging area of research is what I label it as. This last big area, management area, 3 things we're going to talk about. There's only 2, but you get a bonus slide. First, time to collection. And when I talk about time to collection, I mean from the cow having the calf to the time that you harvest that milk. So Sabine Mann has done a lot of really great colostrum work lately. If you want to deep dive into this topic, recommend looking through her literature. She just posted a study 2025 looking into that time to collection and how it affects colostrum yield as well as quality. And what she found and what she really well graphed here is that as time from calving increases, colostrum yield also increases, particularly once we kind of get past that 6-hour mark. Now, is it a huge increase? Not necessarily, but there's an increase there. Now, I put colostrum in this slide in quotation marks. I do that because as we get further out, we also see immunoglobulin concentrations decrease. So once we hit that 8-hour mark, they start to decrease. And that kind of brings up the debate. The thing that you can go back and forth all day on is if we harvest at, say, 12 hours, are we truly getting that high immunoglobulin concentrated product that we consider to be colostrum? Or are we starting to get into what might be considered transition milk? Um, could debate that all day. But based off this information, based off of what we've known in the past, general recommendation, harvest less than 8 hours after calving, less than 6 hours is great too. If you're going to feed the dam's colostrum to her own calf, aim for less than 2 hours after calving, and that's really to make sure you get time to get it into the calf. The next management item, oxytocin use, gets brought up, I think, a lot on farms when we're really banging our head against the wall trying to figure out what to do, especially when it comes to heifers. What we do know is some initial research suggests that it can be beneficial. It can boost colostrum yields in primiparous cows. This is another Sabine Mann study out of Cornell where she looked at dosing oxytocin. And what they did is they did 40 IU, 20 IU, and no oxytocin. And they found that in those older animals, didn't really do much. In those first calf heifers, those primiparous animals, the 40 IU did boost colostrum yields compared to no oxytocin and compared to 20 IU. 20 IU didn't seem to do much in this study. Now, this research kind of comes with a big grain of salt. It is really the only study out there, at least that I know of, that has looked at oxytocin specifically for colostrum production. It's one study taken during one time of the year on one farm. We would really need a lot more information there and kind of replicate this study across farms and seasons and milking systems to know if this is actually a consistent effect. But if you are interested in using oxytocin, I have two big things I always remind people of. Make sure that you discuss it with your vet, especially if this is a route that you want to pursue. Get that dosing in line and talk to them. That's an important thing to consider no matter what injection we're doing. So make sure we're talking about it. The second is really, really consider who would be administering it and when and where they would do it. I bring this up because I had a great example of this talking to a farmer, and they were really frustrated with colostrum yields, and they had thought about using oxytocin, and they decided not to. And the reason they did that is because on their farm, they have 3 people who are allowed to give injections. Those are the only people on farm allowed to touch a needle. And they did not want to open that up to their entire fresh cow team or their entire parlor team because they really wanted to control who's allowed to give injections. So consider that for your farm. Does it fit into how you want to manage things like that? And who's going to do it, when and where are they going to do it? This is the bonus slide. The great thing about making really fun, beautiful slides is they look great. Downside is when you realize you forgot to add something, it's kind of difficult to add it back to those beautiful slides. So heat abatement was a late add-on. What we know is heat abatement, specifically heat stress, does negatively affect colostrum yields. A great study where they looked at cooled animals, heat stressed animals, and then cooled animals that were pair fed with those heat stressed animals to determine if it's heat stress or is it dry matter intake that's kind of pushing that lower colostrum yields. They found that as you hit that heat stress, those animals did produce less colostrum. So big, big thing to make sure that we keep our dry cows cool. So that is all the factors, right? There's a million other ones that we could probably talk about that there's been 1 or 2 studies on, but these are kind of the big ones that really pop out to me. Now, if you're like me and you've hit this point in the presentation or understanding, and you go, well, gee, that's a lot of factors to keep track of. A lot of things that you said, well, we know this, but we don't know this. Good to know, but what can I actually do with this on farm? What can I do on my own farm, or what can I tell my producers to do if they're struggling? So the big one that I always start with is dry period length. If you're not already, or if you're having short dry periods, if you have a lot of cows coming in under that 40 days, let's get that in line. Try to aim for more of a traditional 45 to 60, 40 to 60, something like that. It is going to help us get more colostrum compared to a short dry period. Mastitis management, minimize, treat, address. Is it necessarily going to get you the most colostrum? Potentially not. But I think it's important to address because it does play into other things that may be affecting colostrum yield. Consider the environmental stressors during that dry period. Like we just talked about, cool those cows, try not to have them heat stress. Make sure we have consistent and adequate access to feed and water. When I said before, if you hit those kind of core nutrient needs, you're doing good. Well, if I can't consistently get to feed, I can't eat enough feed to hit those needs, right? It becomes an issue. So we want to make sure we can get to feed and water and avoid overcrowding twofold. It plays into the ability to get adequate access to feed and water. Then it also plays into some other things like maybe not having enough laying down time, might be more heat stress if we're in a really packed pen. Considerations there. When it comes to the milking side, we've gotten into the parlor and we're trying to harvest this colostrum. Calm, low stress milking environment. Please do not choose to listen to your screamo death metal music when we are milking the fresh cows. And you might laugh, but I think myself and other people have been on farms where it's getting pretty close to that genre of music. Calm, low stress milking environment. Make sure that we're doing proper prep and complete milk out before unit removal. This is something that you can kind of get away with a little bit in your milking cows. And when I say that, I mean, you might get less milk, but you're still going to get milk. If we don't do this right in fresh cows, we really risk getting low colostrum. Consider oxytocin if you think it is the right fit for you. First lactation cows would be who it's kind of fit for. And make sure when you do that, you talk to your vet and you consider who, where, and when. Diet formulation, I don't know if nutritionists will rejoice or be a little disappointed when I say diet formulation probably isn't the silver bullet that's going to solve all of your colostrum yield issues. Evaluate your diets though and make sure that you are meeting those needs, especially during this time of the year. We are starting to, a lot of people are switching into their new crop corn silage or they're changing haylage piles, things like that. Make sure that we're getting those specs in line. Considering those younger animals, they might benefit from having some higher levels of metabolizable protein. And then if you're thinking about feed additives, make sure that you're assessing it. Look for research-backed products. Don't trust, give them your money and trust that it's going to help colostrum. So what do I do now? I'm working on getting my colostrum yields higher. I'm doing all these things with my cows, but I still got to feed my calves. They still need colostrum. How do I manage through that aspect of things? Three kind of main points that I talk about with farmers. And that's the first one is if you aren't already, build a colostrum bank. Make sure that you are testing colostrum quality, label and store it accordingly. So that way we can really focus on getting high quality colostrum into those animals. And then follow proper storage practices for this colostrum bank. When it comes to storage, you really don't want to refrigerate for more than a day. Don't freeze for more than a year. Ideally, you don't need to have an entire year freezed up, but make sure that if you do have stuff that's older than that, it's probably time to pitch it. Follow restaurant rules. I laugh because I tell people this, and then I went to the coffee shop the other day and I saw on their not billboard, their little board right there, like all of these things were on there. So follow the same rules that the restaurants follow. First in, first out. Clean environment. Do not shoot yourself in the foot when you're struggling with low colostrum yields by also having the colostrum restored get contaminated, right? It's going to cause more headaches. Clean environment, proper labeling, monitor temperature. get a thermometer. They're relatively cheap on like Amazon, and ideally get one that's going to alarm when you get out of range. That way, middle of the night, for some reason, your freezer kicks out, you're going to know right away, and you can potentially go in there and save that liquid gold, that colostrum. It's a lot better than going out to the barn in the morning and finding a very warm freezer full of ruined colostrum. And then lastly, have colostrum replacer available. No matter what, I don't think I've been on a farm yet who has never had to use a colostrum replacer for some reason. Have some on hand in case you need it. Select a colostrum replacer, not a supplement. A supplement is beneficial, but those we want to use when we are adding them to colostrum. It's spiking the colostrum. If you're trying to replace an entire meal, like I don't have colostrum, I need to get something into this calf, you want to use a replacer. Dairy Calf and Heifer Association's gold standards are a colostrum replacer should provide 300 grams of IgG. What you're probably going to see on the market, a little bit more common, is a 150 to 200. Those are probably adequate as long as you're making sure that the calf is getting all of that. So this whole presentation we've had so far, I kind of have the 3 take-home messages, and they play into what we've discussed. So first one, there are a lot of things that influence colostrum yield, a lot that we are learning, a lot that we don't know, but I think we have a clearer picture than we had 10, 20 years ago. Seasonal swings are real. Don't be surprised if you see some lower yields during the fall and winter, but they're not the sole cause of low yields. There are management practices that you can do to help promote colostrum yields. I'm not going to relist every one that I said, but it's really focusing in that dry period, making sure that we're getting enough of those nutrients into them, that we're ensuring it's an adequate dry period, and then focusing on that harvest time frame. Is it calm? Is it a smooth process for the animal? Are we getting her completely milked out? And then lastly, when you are dealing with periods of low colostrum supply, really fine tune your colostrum management. If you don't already have a bank, get a bank. And if you do have a bank, make sure that we're really fine tuning how we're working with that. And then I put this on here because it's kind of become much more of a topic in research. We're seeing more information come out. It seems like every other week, something in JDS has a mention of colostrum lately. So stay tuned. There's a lot that we don't know, but I think a lot that we are continuing to learn. And I'm excited to read more of the literature that comes out there. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that are out there.
Thank you, Katelyn. We appreciate the information that you shared with us. I would mention to folks listening to go ahead and type into the chat box any questions you may have. We've got one question in there already. Jennifer asked, was this on a Holstein herd? Are there any comparisons of oxytocin use based on breeds and colostrum production?
Yeah, so I do not remember off the top of my head whether that was a Holstein or a Jersey herd. It was one singular herd out of New York. I believe it was one breed. So like I said, it's one research study. So we don't really have a lot across breeds, across milking systems, all of these different things. So it's a start, but we don't know.
Caitlin, what about differences and regional differences from north to south? And so as is like colder here, differences in light and things like that. Is there any changes you think of that colostrum as we go further south to Florida or even into Central South America?
Yes. So there is a really good um, meta-analysis or review, I guess you could say, that Erickson did. And they did look at farms that were located at different longitude, latitude, whichever one it is, kind of up and down the United States. And what they found is that those more northern herds did see lower colostrum yields just in general compared to those southern herds. So I think it's an interesting thing. I don't know. It probably plays into some of that photo period and temperature. I'd love to hear more conversation and see more information about how that might be playing into it, but there is some information out there about that.
Okay, we've got a uh, question, and had come in earlier. Does low yield go hand in hand with low quality, or are they two different issues?
Yes. So yes, yeah. They go hand in hand, they don't go hand in hand. And I actually thought about this before I presented. I was like, well, dang it, I forgot to kind of mention that when we talk about low yield specifically in this presentation, I was really focusing on lower yields that are still maintaining that similar IgG concentration. Unless I mentioned it, there are some specific cases where I mentioned you might have higher yields, like the starch. You might have higher yields, but you're going to get lower quality. Um, and what we know is they can go hand in hand and they can be separate. We can see things that improve yields but don't improve that IgG concentration. So we end up with lower concentration of IgG. It can affect other things in colostrum. We could probably have a whole other conversation on what defines high quality, what is quality in colostrum. So they're related. In this presentation specifically, my main focus was on yields where we still maintain quality, low versus high.
Okay, Mike asked, can you give a short summary on factors changing the IgG levels?
Oh, um, yes and no. So when I really dove into this, looking at yields, what I can say is that in my brain, I have a lot of the yield information ready to go. So right now, I can't like go down the list and tell you everything that's IgG related. A lot of these things play in some way, shape, or form. There's some protein things that might be related to IgG. Um, there's various things that are related there. And I think that's almost another conversation just based off of how this presentation is slotted. And I'm happy to kind of have that conversation and share with people via email, whatever it is. But off the top of my head right now, I can't like give you the long list.
Okay, very good. Tim mentions that typically he runs into these low colostrum production periods. Many of the times it's older cows that are producing less or none, and the heifers are doing okay. So is this not exclusively a young cow issue?
No, it's not exclusively a young cow issue. There's just probably a tendency to see lower yields with younger cows, but it's not the only thing that can cause it, especially if we are managing heifers and those first calf heifers potentially separately than our older animals. So if we have maybe separate dry cow pens or different diets there, I wouldn't be surprised that there could be differences between the older and the younger animals.
Very good. Bill mentions, I have seen dairies give oxytocin to all 10 fresh cows and then to proceed to milk them one at a time. So there's a lot of time from shot to milking. Do you have a suggestion for maximum time from shot to colostrum harvest?
So I will shy away from answering that a little bit just because, like I said, we really only have that one study, that Sabine Mann study that looked at it. In her study, they did, I believe it was 45 seconds from shot to milker unit attachment, and that was in a rotary, so they were able to kind of do that easier. So and she even mentions it in that study in like the conclusions that we really need more information that looks at different timings of the injection of unit attachment of stimulation before we can really say this is what's the best.
Very good. I'm not seeing an additional question, but I do have one. You mentioned replacer and supplements.
Yes.
Share with us what the actual difference is between those two products.
Yeah, so the primary difference is going to be your immunoglobulin concentrations in there. Your supplements are typically going to be lower than your replacer, and that really plays into what the purpose is. A replacer is meant to completely replace a colostrum meal. A supplement is usually meant to be used to basically, to quote somebody that I know, they recently called it spiking colostrum. So you have medium quality colostrum, maybe you want to up the IgG level a little bit, you would use that supplement to kind of spike it. So there's usually lower IgG in the supplement.
Very good. I'm not seeing any questions coming in. Thank you, Katelyn, for sharing this information and giving your insights on strategies that affect colostrum yield. This program has been recorded and will be available on the Four-State Dairy Nutrition and Management Conference website. Allow us 5 to 7 working days to get it up. In addition, I will email you when it is available, as well as including the link for the program evaluation. Thank you for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar in December when Dr. Paul Kononoff will discuss changes in how we feed alfalfa in our dairy rations. I'll conclude by wishing everybody a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you now, and I'm closing out.